Hi everyone, and welcome to the next training video for our series in Numbers. We're looking at Numbers chapters 22 to 24, the story of Balaam and the donkey. And as always, why don't you set aside a bit of time now just to press pause and to pray for your groups and for our time in God's Word right now. Okay, there's our sort of summary slide, and we are now, if you see it, at Numbers 22 verse 1, we find ourselves on the plains of Moab. We're into the third and final location in the book of Numbers, and we've moved into generation 2. And now there's a strange kind of interlude, which actually doesn't continue the story of Israel as such. It's actually, it's almost like the author zooms out and we get a view of Israel from the perspective of one of the foreign kings, one of the foreign enemies, this man Balak. So it's a reminder to us that there is this one nation traveling to the promised land, and what's happening to this nation has implications for the rest of the world. What we'll do now is just focus on two things: the whole confusion with Balaam, and just trying to decide what kind of man was he, and why did God kind of send him on his way to go and meet with King Balak, but then judge him for doing that. We'll try and explain that apparent contradiction, and then we'll look a bit at the oracles of Balaam. So the confusion arises in the story because you see Balaam saying some quite impressive things about God and suggesting a relationship with God. Then we see God in chapter 22 verse 20 here giving him permission to go. And then when he does go, we see God getting angry with that. Let's try and explain what's going on here. Two things to realize is that just if we zoom out and look at the rest of the Bible's teaching about Balaam, we see that the Bible's view of him is a very negative one. Even later on in the book of Numbers, Balaam is blamed for being involved in what happens in Numbers 25, where the people rebel against God and commit idolatry. So we're not given details exactly what happened there, but somehow Balaam was involved in that. They were following Balaam's advice, and because of that they turned away. So that's in the book of Numbers. But even as we come to the New Testament, 3 times Balaam is cast in a very negative light. In 2 Peter 2, in Jude 11, and in Revelation 2. You can pause the screen and look at those verses if you want. But overall, it's just worth noting at the start that the Bible has a negative view of Balaam. Okay, but what about the apparent contradiction here in Numbers 22 to 24? First thing to realize, of course, is that at base level he is a prophet for hire. He's known to be able to put curses on people. Yes, he seems to have some knowledge of God. There were people outside of Israel, people like Melchizedek, even the prostitute Rahab, and Balaam as well, who seem to have had some knowledge of the Creator God. Balaam seems to have some knowledge of him, but he's also a prophet for hire. He's also known across the world to be someone who can, if you give him the right amount, if you meet his fee, he will call down curses on your enemies. That's why Balak contacts him. Now, through all of this, of course, we must remember that God knows exactly what's going on. When this delegation comes from Balak to meet with Balaam, and God asks the question, who are these men with you? Of course, God is not ignorant. He knows exactly what's happening. He knows the motives of Balak. He knows the motives of Balaam. So when he asks a question in these situations, he's actually asking the question for the sake of probing Balaam. It's just a little indication that God is trying to steer things. God is trying to use the situation for his own ends. Of course, God straight away, his first instruction is very clear. do not go with these men. You must not put a curse on those people because they are blessed. That is the underlying thing. These are God's chosen, blessed people. Why would Balaam even consider cursing them? So that is the fundamental instruction from God to bear in mind. What's telling is that when Balaam reports this to the delegation, he doesn't actually give them the full picture. He says, go back to your own country, for the Lord has refused to let me go with you. That's actually not what the Lord did. The Lord told him just that from the beginning, this idea of trying to curse his people it just cannot happen. So the delegation report back to Balak, Balaam refused to come with us, and they don't actually have the full reason why Balaam refused to come. So again, Balaam is kind of keeping the door open here, it would seem. This is confirmed later on. Here in verse 18, yes, he says something very impressive. The delegation return, a more impressive delegation return with even more money. Balaam turns them down again with this quite pious response. But then look at verse 19. Now stay here tonight as the others did, and I will find out what else the Lord will tell me. Again, just kind of leaving the door open, perhaps hoping that there might be some way he can get his hands on some money. Now, why then does God kind of let him go and then judge him for going? So God lets him go here and then is angry with him for doing so. We must remember that, as I said earlier, God is in complete control. I think his aim here is to give Balaam a vivid picture of what he thinks of someone who can curse the people that he has blessed. So the anger here, I think, is more God's judgment and anger against the whole set of events. But then he will also use this series of events to give a vivid picture of how he can take a dodgy prophet who's willing to earn money from an enemy king to curse God's people. God will take that crazy series of events and he will use that situation, even that situation, to turn it into a record of blessings for his people. So I think that's why God is willing to let Balaam go, because he's sovereign over the situation. He's going to use the situation. He's willing to let Balaam go, but he's also, as Balaam goes, he's going to show Balaam his judgment. And he does that through this situation of the angel meeting with Balaam on his donkey. We get a sort of underlying summary of what God thinks of Balaam here in Numbers 22. Eventually the angel of the Lord, eventually God opens Balaam's eyes and he can see the angel of the Lord. But then look at the verdict here from God. I have come here to oppose you because your path is a reckless one before me. There's the summary verdict from God against Balaam. There seems to be some kind of repentance from Balaam here. It's temporary, it's flawed, but he seems to get a real wake-up call. And then when he eventually gets to King Balak, he really is willing to just pass on whatever message God gives him. So that takes us to the oracles of Balaam. And there's a cycle here that is repeated 3 times. It starts with Balak, under Balaam's instruction, building altars and making sacrifices. It was a common pagan thing to call down a curse on your enemy. You make a sacrifice to your God. So we see Balak doing that. Then Balaam goes off to meet with God privately. The Lord puts a word in Balaam's mouth, or his spirit comes to give Balaam the words to speak. Similar language, by the way, to what was used when the donkey spoke. The Lord opened the donkey's mouth to speak. So again, here's where the picture is completed. Just like God used a donkey to speak to hard-hearted Balaam, so God can use Balaam to reveal things to hard-hearted Balak. Then Balaam gives his oracle, and the oracle is nothing but blessing on Israel. Balak has gone to all this expense, all this effort to try and call down a curse on his enemy, and all he gets is blessing, and so of course he's very angry. That happens 3 times on the third occasion, Balak sends Balaam away without paying him anything. And just a quick, I showed this in the sermon, but just a quick record of these oracles. It's just interesting to note that the foundational, kind of fundamental promises of God to Israel when he called Abraham, when he promised to make Abraham into a great nation, he makes promises to him. The first promise, you see it in Genesis 12 and Genesis 17, is that they would be very fruitful, they would be a great nation. And this is repeated in Balaam's first oracle. Another foundational promise to Abraham is that this people would enjoy a special kind of relationship of blessing with God, that there'd be a covenant between God and this people. And again, this is the main theme of Balaam's second oracle. Another foundational promise of God to Abraham is that they would have a special land where they would dwell, this land of Canaan. And this is emphasized in Balaam's third oracle. So it is quite striking that through this crazy series of events of an evil king and a dodgy prophet, God can use those situations to just re-emphasize the promises that he's made. The final oracle from Balaam just talks about a special king, a king who will bring destruction on his enemies, a king who will emerge from the people of Jacob. A scepter will rise out of Israel. Again, this ties back to promises made by God all the way back in Genesis. And just as we look further on in the Old Testament, the sort of summary from a number of places in Deuteronomy, in Joshua, in Nehemiah, what the Bible picks up on is this fundamental idea that the Lord can turn a curse into a blessing. Balak and to a degree Balaam wanted to curse God's people. God can use people who are looking to curse his people to actually bless them. That's how in control he is. Of course, all of this is happening without Israel even knowing it. They are sitting on the plains of Moab. They don't even know about these events. They only somehow hear about them later. But it's a reminder to us of just how sovereign God is, that he is at work to protect his people, that even though there are people scheming to curse and to oppose his people, God will make sure they are protected. God will make sure they are blessed, because he is the God who's promised to do that. I hope that's helpful, and I hope your studies go really well this week.